I'm Professor Kaija Schilde, Jean Monnet Professor of Security and Defense here at Boston University, Pardee School of Global Studies. I'm the Director of the Center for the Study of Europe here at Pardee. And I'm delighted today to welcome our speaker, Dimitrios Skiadas, who will be speaking to us about EU migration policy, the Union's choice for spending instead of policy making, and the impact on EU legitimacy and rule of law. Professor Skiadas is a professor of European governance and Jean Monnet Chair at the Department of International and European Studies at the University of Macedonia. His areas of expertise include European Union law, public law, budgetary law, and project management. From March to August 2021, he was a visiting researcher here, the Center for the Study of Europe. And that was a delightful time when we got to know him well. And so we consider him our colleague here. And so Professor Skiadas, here in the room, we have students from my European integration seminar, a 500 level seminar on European integration, history, theory, and processes and policies. And the students, when we are logged off and for our last class session, at the after our session with you, they will be talking about their final projects in the class, which are group podcast projects where they've been interviewing different subject matter experts on topics such as migration, enlargement, defense, and different aspects of essentially EU in the world and EU foreign affairs and external relations. And so they are well prepared to have this conversation. And so please welcome and go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Kaija. It's always a pleasure to see that familiar room in which I spent 6 months during my stay there on a daily basis, as Elizabeth might remember. But it has been quite gratifying experience. So I'm very happy to see you all again. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it this time to be there, but hopefully I will be there in springtime. So we'll have the opportunity of seeing each other in person, not just via Zoom, and discuss further our interests, our common interests. I'm very happy to see young people being interested in topics such as migration, defense, security. All these are very hot topics in the EU agenda. And my take today, my idea is to give you a presentation about how the EU has decided to draft and implement a migration policy without implementing it, however. And that is a keynote that I would like you to take away with you at the end of this presentation. Let me, first of all, thank Professor Schilde for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And I know that she's very interested in issues such as security, such as migration as a threat to security in Europe. And I know that she has prepared you quite well in order to interrogate me. And please, afterwards, do ask me questions about anything that you feel that I should clarify with regard to my presentation. So, as I said, EU migration policy, the Union's choice for spending instead of policy making. I have decided to take the following course in order to present you these ideas. First of all, I'm going to give you some figures regarding migration in Europe as it is now. And I will give you also some historical figures in order for you to see the development of the migration situation in Europe. Then I'm going to give you an overview of the legal regime regarding migration in Europe. And I will highlight some recent developments regarding the amendment of this regime and the potential for future improvements. Then I will present to you the political action, or in my at least view, inaction of the European Union with regard to migration. And then I will present to you the resources provided, the money given by the EU. And as you will see, the EU is always proud of giving away money. It's one of the issues that the European Union is very good at. So we'll have an overview of the money given with regard to migration, and then I will conclude with some reflections upon which, of course, we are all free to ask me questions, clarifications, and so on. Now, the figures. This is one of the most recent, I think the most recent figure that we have with regard to migration. In Europe, we have two major situations regarding migration. The one is in the Mediterranean, and the other one is in Ukraine. I'm starting with the Mediterranean situation. You see that according to the latest reports, we have some migration flows taking three main routes: the eastern route from Greece, the central route from Italy, and the western route from Spain. And you see the amount, the figures, the people crossing in Europe, coming from Africa or Middle East mainly. And you see the figures there in Greece, Italy, and Spain. The overall arrivals this year, the latest update in the 3rd of December, 4 days ago, is 251,375 persons have crossed into Europe from the Mediterranean, either via sea or via land. Fortunately, during the same period, we had some casualties. More than 2,664 persons lost their lives in their effort to come to Europe. In order to have an idea of what has happened in the past, and the year, let's say the reference year was 2015, you see that at that time, during the civil war in Syria, we had more than 1 million arrivals in Europe from the Mediterranean Sea, and we had and that course, of course, changed, and you will see why. We will talk about it. And you see that also there have been several people that lost their lives in their effort to come to Europe. That figure has led to the Mediterranean being characterized as the most dangerous path for migration throughout the world. It is the place where most lives have been lost in the effort from someone to come from Africa or Middle East in Europe. This infographic gives you an idea of the sharp peak that was noted during 2015. As you saw, 1 million arrivals. And you see that the eastern route, the route from Greece, was at that time the most preferred choice. As you see at the right part of the screen as we see it, now the most preferred route is the central route from Italy. Again, another idea regarding irregular arrivals. Again, you see that back in 2015, the most preferred route of someone to get to Europe was the central route, excuse me, the eastern route from Greece. Now the central route is the more preferred route that exists using the Italian path. This reference gives you an idea of what happens outside Europe for those coming from Africa in order to come to Europe. You see that there are various situations throughout the African continent that cause people to migrate. This will help us understand one of the major funding schemes that has been established in Europe, the EU Trust Fund for Africa, that supports migrants coming from Africa or supports countries to keep their population there in order not to have such an increased migration flow. You see that there are areas in Central Africa, in Nigeria, or in Gambia or Guinea that try to come to Europe, crossing sometimes the entire Central Africa in order to come to Northern Africa, and then from Tripoli to try to reach Italy, or from Algeria and then to Spain. There are also very unstable parts, especially in the eastern part of Africa, which cause people to migrate. Of course, there are conditions where there is no control of the situation, and this leads to people trying to seek security in other parts of the world, including, of course, Europe. So you see the paths here in the African continent and how people arrive at the source, the southern source of the Mediterranean, in order to try to cross to Spain or Italy. Now, some interesting facts that have been put forward by Europol, European Union's police entity, police organization. Over 90% of those illegal migrants that are coming to Europe are being facilitated by criminal groups. So that means that the migration that we have seen, the migration flows that we have seen, take place mainly within a criminal group or organized by a criminal organization. The migratory flows do not follow a stable path, and they are affected by weather conditions, by border controls. This leads to always seek alternative routes of migration. As we speak, over 250 points for facilitating illegal migrations have been identified in and out of the European Union. That's a lot. With regard to the structure of the smuggling networks of these migrants, there are three main, let's say, actors: the persons in charge who coordinate the activities during the course, the organizers who regulate the relevant activities at local level, using usually their personal connections with authorities there, and the occasional service providers operating at very basic level. For instance, those that have the boats with which the migrants are being transferred. Smuggling illegal migrants, it's a profitable activity for those involved in this activity. It has very low operating costs. The conditions of the boats used are dreadful, and we have seen that quite recently and dramatically, I might add. And there's always a constant high demand for smuggling. In 2015, which was the year with the most increased migratory flows, the turnover was estimated at about 5 to 6 billion US dollars. 5 to 6 billion US dollars. And cash is the main means of payment. In the case of smuggling by sea, the cost varies from 2,500 to 6,000 US dollars per person. As I said, smuggling illegal migrants is a criminal activity itself, but it also takes place within a criminal group. So that means that the persons involved in smuggling illegal migrants are also involved in other criminal activities. We have the phenomenon of polycriminality. That's a complex phenomenon that has to be addressed, because, for instance, you may smuggle migrants, and along with them, you may smuggle drugs. The smuggled migrants, again, they are victims not just for being smuggled, but also for being exploited in terms of labor or sex as a means of payment for the smuggling services. And furthermore, excuse me, I need to do that. Yes, that's it. It has been found that also terrorists use the method of smuggling illegal migrants in order to enter Europe, either as smugglers or as illegal migrants themselves. And this has led to terrorist attacks in Paris in recent years and in other areas in Europe. This is the typical structure of a smuggling network as constructed by Europol. You see the various agents, you see the various actors involved in order to have such a network working. And this is a global phenomenon. All migrant smuggling networks have a similar structure, involving legal businesses, involving the money handlers, involving corrupt officials in countries of origin or destination, the low-level facilitators, the brokers, those that provide the documents that might be required, the local leaders, and the network leader. You see that there are plenty of people involved in smuggling. It's not just one-man show. Now, the other migration situation that we have in Europe is the Ukrainian one, caused by the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Several million people have fled Ukraine in order to seek safety in other countries or in Russia, depending on on their own understanding of safety. And furthermore, the European Union, along with UN agencies and NGOs, has prepared a plan, the so-called Regional Refugee Response Plan, according to which people are being facilitated as refugees in other countries of the European Union. And you see here, with the variation of colors throughout Europe, how the migrants, how the refugees from Ukraine have been distributed mainly in Germany and Poland and Lithuania, and then in Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, and other countries in Europe. This is a more detailed account of the countries participating in the Refugee Response Fund, plan, excuse me. And you see also that Russia has received several refugees from Ukraine. More than 1 million people have migrated to Russia. And this is just a list of other countries that have received larger or smaller amount of refugees from Ukraine due to the Russian invasion. So, having seen these figures, it's quite imperative and useful to understand the legal regime. According to the European Union's legal approach of migration, there are two main strategic approaches. These are distinct, yet mutually influential. The first approach is the so-called sovereignty approach, and tackles migration as a source of external, initially, and internal, subsequently, danger for the security of the EU member states and the safety of their people, and is being developed within the framework of the common security and defense policy. Classic examples are Operation Sophia before a few years, and now Operation Irene. The second approach, which is the approach that we're going to explore in detail today, is the humanitarian approach, focusing on issues arising from the impact of the EU activities on migrants. And this is being developed within the framework of the so-called EU policy on migration, which is a field of shared competence between the Union and the member states. And it entails measures of managing migratory flows and measures for controlling and averting migration. For instance, Frontex has implemented 19 joint operation actions in order to tackle migration. And we will come to that later.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Could you repeat the first strategy?
Yes, it's the sovereignty approach. The sovereignty approach focuses on migration as a risk, as a danger for the security of the EU member states. Either external danger, meaning that migrants come from outside the European Union, or internal danger when migrants enter the EU and we have illegal migrants, and they are considered for some countries to be a risk for their societies. So this is the dual approach that the EU has adopted, and it has formulated according strategies for each one.
Thank you.
Now, the legal context within which the EU is called to act in order to manage migration is based on the fact that migration falls within the so-called shared competencies of the European Union. What do we mean by the term shared competencies? Both the EU and the member states adopt legislation or issue legally binding decisions in this sector. Both the EU and the member states. That is a combination of competence. And in order to regulate that combination, we have the principle of subsidiarity, according to which the EU shall act only if and insofar as the objectives of the proposed action cannot be sufficiently achieved by the member states. So in the case of migration, the EU has, let's say, accepted the precedents of the member states in tackling migration, and it acts, as we will see, in order to support the national actions regarding migration. And the EU migration policy is being structured along these lines. Now, the main issues that can be seen as challenging with regard to the EU legal regime of migration entail 5 main points. The second area, the Dublin system, the EU-Turkey statement or agreement, as we will see, there is a debate about its legal nature, Frontex, which is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency and its operation, and the reform of this legal regime on migration. Now, the second area. This is the second area. The blue countries, dark blue. According to the concept of Schengen is a small village in Luxembourg, and we call it the second area because this is where it all started, as you will see in a moment. You will see, what I want you to remember from this map is that within all countries that are being colored in dark blue, there is freedom of movement without any procedure. You can move throughout these countries using only your ID card, as if you were in your own country. Now, the light blue countries do not accept yet people with ID cards. They need to have the people going there need to have passports and visas. And also there are some non-EU countries, such as Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland, which accept EU citizens to enter their borders without any proceedings as they participate in the second area. As you see, there is a combination of regimes in the second area. Now, how second came to be. During the 1980s, 5 member states of the European Union, Belgium, France, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, created a territory without internal borders. They signed an agreement in Schengen, a small city in Luxembourg, and within that area, the freedom of movement was guaranteed. You have no internal borders and a single external border. Whatever their location, there are no controls within this area. There are no checks in this area. And the officers working at the external border perform the same border checks everywhere. They have identical procedures, and they have common rules regarding visas and the right to asylum. Now, in order to keep a balance between freedom and security, because security is a major consideration for these issues, the member states participating in Schengen have introduced also the so-called compensatory measures. They focus on cooperation and coordination with regard to the work of the police and judicial authorities in order to combat organized crime networks and safeguard internal security. The arrangements regarding Schengen were incorporated formally in the EU framework in 1997 by the Treaty of Amsterdam. In 2015, due to the terrorist attacks in Paris and the dramatic increase of migration inflows, and also again in 2020, due to the COVID pandemic, internal border controls were reintroduced. This activity caused some concerns due not to its existence, because it was always a possibility to reintroduce internal border controls, but to its prolongation. Several of these measures were prolonged by some states, and the European Commission, the European Parliament condemned them, using a very strong phrasing: when Schengen dies, Europe dies. And why is that? Well, let's take into account Schengen's significance. More than 400 million people are allowed to travel freely between member states without going through border controls. Every day, around 3.5 million people cross internal borders in order to go to work, to study, or to visit a friend or family. And almost 1.7 million people reside in one second country while they work in another second country, usually a neighboring one. So, on an annual basis, the Europeans living within the Schengen area make an estimated 1.2 billion journeys within Schengen. You may understand what Schengen means for the freedom of movement in the European Union. So any reintroduction of internal border controls hinders these movements. And this is not something that will contribute to the promotion of European integration, of course. Now, how Schengen operates? Well, before traveling, one should know that coming from an area from the European Economic Area, or Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, he may enter Europe without problem. Otherwise, he's either in need of a visa, or he should ask for a travel authorization from the proper authorities in order to avoid requiring a visa. During what happens in practice when you go to the external borders of Schengen, the individual is checked against the relevant databases, and if you are coming from a country that is within Schengen, then everything is fine. If not, the individual is checked against the relevant databases, and the compliance with Schengen entry condition is checked, and the refusal of entry is possible. When leaving the Schengen area, again, the individual is checked against the relevant databases, and he is free to go. Otherwise, if he is not a member, if he's not a national of a Schengen area member state, then he may exit, of course, but he's registered if there is a problem, and there will be further, let's say, consequences when he will try to re-enter Schengen. Now, with regard to irregular arrivals, of course, when the individuals are being apprehended, they are checked against national, European, and international databases. They are identified and fingerprinted, and if they are found to have no right to stay in Schengen, in the Schengen area, they are just sent home. This is how Schengen works in 2 words. Let's go to the second point, the Dublin system. I don't know, is the second system clear for you so far?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. The Dublin system. The Dublin system is based on 3 legal texts: the Dublin Convention back in the 1990, the Dublin II regulation in 2003, and the Dublin III regulation in 2013. This system established criteria and mechanisms for determining whether an EU member state is responsible or not for examining an asylum application. And at least the original idea was to ensure quick access to asylum procedure and the examination of an application in substance by a single, clearly determined member state. The core principle underlying the existing regime is that the responsibility of examining an asylum claim lies first and foremost with the member state which plays the greatest part in the applicant's entry to the EU. Now, in most cases, but not in all of them, but in most cases, this means the member state of first entry. Or, for instance, a member state which issued a visa or residence permit to a third country national. And when you have circumstances pertaining family unity or protection of accompanied minors, then you may have a derogation from the rules involved in Dublin. This principle is based on one assumption. All EU member states are considered to be safe states. That means that they are considered to meet the criteria set by the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees and Asylum Seekers. So, in whichever country you enter from, in order to put it simply, if you enter the EU by any country, then that country is considered to be a safe country, and that country has to examine an application for asylum. However, this situation has led to an increased number of applications being filed in a small number of member states, usually those in Southern Europe. And the Dublin system cannot ensure a sustainable sharing of responsibilities, especially for asylum applicants across the EU. The entire system was put on hold by several countries, like Germany, Sweden, the United Kingdom, Austria, Denmark, when the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice of the European Union found that the national systems on some countries, Belgium and Greece in particular, with regard to granting asylum, had severe problems. They caused lengthy delays and provided very limited possibilities for a successful application. In 2011, the European Parliament went as far to recommend the non-implementation of the Dublin regulation. And since then, the Dublin system is under review, and we will see what that review entails in a few minutes. So these are the rules under Dublin. When applying the Dublin rules, the country of arrival is in most cases identified as the one responsible for asylum. This causes a problem. Most arrivals occur in Italy and Greece due to the conditions that we saw before when we were seeing the figures. And the asylum systems of these countries are put under immense pressure. And of course, this does not lead to a fair distribution of responsibility. Now, we have harmonized conditions of reception throughout the EU. There are common standards in the European Union ensuring that asylum seekers are treated equally in an open and fair system. However, according to the Dublin system, the asylum seekers cannot choose which country is going to manage their application. In order, however, to avoid registration, some migrants try to move to other countries, such as Germany, for instance, in order to have a more, let's say, adequate procedure regarding their application. And this is a secondary movement which puts into risk the internal population of all those countries. So Dublin has not just affects the countries of first entry, but also the other countries which are the primary, let's say, target for those migrants. They want to go there. They don't want to come to Greece or Italy. They want to go to Germany, to France, or to another country where they have reasons to be there. The third point of interest regarding the EU legal regime is the EU-Turkey statement or agreement. That agreement took place on the 18th of March 2016, when the heads of state of Turkey and the EU agreed to end the flow of irregular migration from Turkey to the EU and replace it with a more organized and safe system. What is the core principle of this statement, of this agreement? All new irregular migrants or asylum seekers crossing from Turkey to the Greek islands will be returned to Turkey after having their asylum claim assessed in line with EU international law. And Turkey is going to be considered a safe country for such a return. And for every Syrian being returned to Turkey, another Syrian will be resettled from Turkey to the EU, the so-called one-to-one mechanism. In parallel, the EU wanted to facilitate Turkey in various aspects and activities. Therefore, it allowed it provided for significant resources under the Facility for Refugees in Turkey. We'll see about that. And it decided to re-examine the visa regime for Turkish nationals to enter the EU, and it will upgrade the EU-Turkey customs union. Now, everyone who applies for asylum in Greece has his application treated on a case-by-case basis, adhering the principle of non-refoulement. There are individual interviews, individual assessments, and rights of appeal. There is no blanket or automatic return. This is the regime established by the EU-Turkey statement. However, in 2017, just a year after this statement was published, was made public, the Court of Justice was called to, the European Court of Justice was called to adjudicate on the actions of 3 migrants against this agreement. The court said that this agreement, despite its expressed warning that the EU and Turkey decided to end the irregular migration and they agreed on specific action points, that document, that text was not an agreement, was a merely statement, a press statement that is not part of EU law. It is, if anyone wants to see it legally, a simple international law agreement which imposes no obligation on EU, but on the member states as individual member states and Turkey. Thus, any violation of this agreement cannot be examined by the European Court of Justice, but by the International Court of Justice or the national courts. So you see that there has been a significant blow to the legal nature of this statement, which has been diminished to a mere press statement. It's not an agreement, it's not a legal document, according to the court's reasoning. I would like to point out that in these cases, the arguments put forward by the EU Council and the Council of Ministers were in line with that reasoning. That this is actually a press statement, nothing more, nothing less. It's not a legal document. However, it's a bit strange to have a legal document that says that the EU will make available resources to Turkey for supporting refugees. The EU will re-examine the visa regime for Turkish nationals to enter the EU. The EU will upgrade the EU-Turkey customs unions, but the document which entails all these actions is not an EU document. It's a document signed by the member states, not by the EU. It's a strange arrangement in any case. And this is what has happened with that agreement. You see the formal photo, and the formal photo, I think, tells everything. You see the then President of Turkey, Professor Davutoglu, Donald Tusk, the then President of the European Council, and Jean-Claude Juncker, the then President of the European Commission. These were the people that signed the agreement, not the member states. But according to the court, this is just a statement, a press statement, not a legal document. With regard to the EU-Turkey refugee deal, you see the arrangements that I explained to you before. What was the impact of this agreement? Well, the impact was significant with regard to the reduction of migration flows. You see here that there has been a drastic reduction of flows from Turkey to Greece. A drastic reduction. And the returns from Greece to Turkey amounted until 2020, because until that time they have been we have been monitoring the application of this agreement. 2,140 persons were returned from Greece to Turkey. And there have been various reasons for which these people selected to go back to Turkey. And you see the reason. There was no way to apply for asylum. They withdrew their application. There was a negative decision, which is the most common case, and closed the case for other reasons. And now we go to Frontex. This is a case that has caused some concerns lately. Frontex is a body that was established in 2004. And its aim is to coordinate cooperation between member states with regard to external border management, to carry out analysis, to support in training, to help requiring technical and operational assistance. The migration crisis prompted the EU institutions to change this mandate. And Frontex was transformed to the so-called European Border and Coast Guard Agency, but we call it Frontex for practical reasons. And now we have a new regime under which Frontex and the national authorities responsible for border management operate together in single schemes. It has a supervisory role, it has a regulatory role, Frontex, but the most crucial, the operational role, is important because it was, at least at the beginning, envisioned that this agency would have the right to intervene on the territory of a member state, even without the consent of the state involved. That approach was not approved finally, and in order for Frontex to begin an operation, there has to be a council decision upon a commission's proposal. In any case, Frontex has a much more operational stance, and in 2019, further competences were given to Frontex, expanding its mandate to integrated planning of operations, to conduct operations in non-EU countries, to provide operational support on land, at sea, and in the air, to provide experts to support national authorities, to focus on post-arrival and post-return assistance, and, that is a crucial point, to enhance its fundamental rights monitoring scheme. That was perhaps the most crucial point that was introduced by the regulation, by the 2019 regulation regarding Frontex. Frontex is now destined to have a quite extensive mandate, and it will need an equally extensive personnel. It's scheduled to amount 10,000 people by 2027. However, in recent years, Frontex has come under significant scrutiny for its alleged role in illegally turning migrants at EU border, the well-known pushbacks. There have been also allegations against Frontex for harassment and misconduct within the service. The Frontex's executive director faced heavy criticism, and that was, let's say, manifestly put forward by a special committee at the European Parliament, accusing the director of failing to protect human rights of asylum seekers. And the committee said that Frontex carried only a superficial investigation on alleged illegal pushbacks. And for instance, there has been severe criticism for failing to appoint the required 40 human rights monitors that had to be appointed in Frontex. The result of this condition was that the European Parliament did not grant the director the discharge with regard to the management of the agency's budget, and this was followed up by an investigation by Olaf, the EU Anti-Fraud Office, which said that it will launch disciplinary action against the director. The result was the director's resignation last year. The review, the final point, the review of EU legal migration, it's an overall review. We have a new pact on migration and asylum that is being suggested, and it covers all aspects, as you see, a new asylum and migration management regulation, new rules regarding migration crisis, update on fingerprinting database, a new EU asylum agency, a new screening regulation, a common asylum procedure, uniform rules on asylum applications, better reception conditions, and a new EU resettlement framework. It is a complete overhaul of the EU regime on migration. However, there has been extensive negotiations, and the result is expected by April 2024. I'm not that optimist, I have to admit. However, we shall see. There are some results so far. For instance, a new EU agency for asylum has been established, replacing the well-known EASO. And we have a return coordinator appointed in order to oversee the return system. And we have recommendations regarding cooperation and preparedness for management of crises regarding migration. The roadmap, in order to finally approve this new pact, this is the roadmap that you see. Personally, I believe that this is an optimistic roadmap, and given the fact that we have an election year in 2024, and the fact that whether we like it or not, we see strange movements of political developments in Europe, I don't think that the EU will have the opportunity of adopting the overall new pact within the current period before the European elections in 2024. Now, the inaction. The EU agenda on migration was established in 2015. It comprised two main pillars, and in order to give you an idea, this is the agenda. We have the immediate response pillar, which focuses on action that had to be taken back in 2015 to tackle the crisis, and a more strategic approach in order to improve the overall system regarding the reduction of incentives for irregular migration, to have a better asylum policy, to improve the search and rescue operations, and an overall policy on legal migration. However, this agenda was based on this approach, the so-called hotspot approach. Hotspots are centers of identification and registration of migrants in specific areas in Greece and Italy in order to be able to have a monitoring of the migration flows. You see, a very complex procedure that unfortunately does not allow for a timely and proper management of these flows, because there are several levels that are involved, levels of administration, and several procedures that have to be taken, have to take place simultaneously, and that's not easy, especially when you are talking about people that do not have all the necessary documentation with them due to the conditions of the departure from their country of origin. So it's a very difficult procedure to handle. Nevertheless, that is the approach, the managerial approach introduced by the EU with regard to migration. Now, there are three courses of action after the registration: the national asylum process, the emergency relocation scheme, or the return system. Most, let's say, interesting is the relocation system, which is a system based on the goodwill of the member states. It's based on the voluntary participation of the member states, and whether, despite the fact that it entails the relocation of 160,000 applicants from Greece and Italy to other member states, only 35,000 were relocated from Greece and Italy to other member states. So you see that it has not been a very successful scheme. I don't want to trouble you with details about the accounts of the Commission regarding the implementation strategy. However, the Commission focused, and we will see why, on the operational support provided to member states and the increased funding given to member states as a demonstration of its solidarity in order to mitigate the consequences of migration flows. I don't want to give you the details. I will send you the presentation anyway, so you will be able to study the details. The new pact, the proposal for the new pact was, as I told you, I don't expect it to be agreed by May, as it is scheduled. However, in June, there was a promising development when the Council agreed on a negotiating position regarding the asylum procedure, and they tried to improve the existing conditions. There is a hope that this system might go through, especially when it comes to the member states that are being burdened by the excessive demand for application procedures. However, I have to point out that the Dublin system, the principle enshrined in the Dublin system, are not amended, at least with regard to this agreement. The responsibility lies again with the first country of entry. And that is a point of concern so far. Now, let me go to the final point, the money. As I told you, the EU is very proud of giving away money in order to achieve its goals. Especially with regard to migration, the resources given by the EU were doubled for the years 2015, 2018, excuse me. And from 9.6 billion euros were increased to 22 billion euros, covering a variety of needs and actions. This is an indicative, not an indicative, a very concise list of the actions that were funded under the increased funding of the EU. You see that the original was 9.6, but it was further increased. And the funding went both to inside and outside the EU. You see that the European Union addresses migration not only as a situation that takes place within the EU and it has to be dealt with when the migrant comes in Europe, but also before coming to Europe, in order to avoid the perspective of migration. And also the incorporation of the incorporation of migrants, the integration of migrants in EU society has been a major concern. You can see that the European Union spent, especially in 2007-2013, an amount of about 4 billion euros in order to facilitate the integration in the member states of the various migrants at that time. Back in 2011, 2010, when these programs were implemented, the amount, the figures of migrants were not so problematic. So the main concern was not to reduce migration, but to manage the migrants within the European societies. With regard to the external dimension, meaning cooperation in order to prevent migrants from coming to Europe. The European Union has spent, again, a significant amount. The problem in that particular case is that the total amount of expenditure could not be established. And that is something that is not a very positive element in the Commission's track record of managing funds regarding migration. It was not clear whether the expenditure was directed in line with intent and geographical and thematic priorities, and there were not quantitative and results-oriented indicators. So we know that some money was spent, but we cannot verify whether this money actually were invested in the most appropriate manner. I've talked to you about the hotspots, and I explained to you their mentality. A couple of words about the history of hotspots in Greece and Italy. Well, it wasn't easy to set them up. It took longer than planned, and the facilities did not meet international standards. And the problem is that the implementation of the proceedings within the hotspots are so lengthy, as you saw, that the hotspots are being transformed from centers of identification, registration, and verification of identities to areas of hospitalization, to areas of just having people staying there until the proper identification has taken place. And this may take months. And people keep coming. So these hotspots are actually bottlenecks in terms of as points of entry in Europe. And you see the budget spent here in the table next to the map. You see the budget spent in Greece and in Italy by the European Union in order to support these mechanisms. Turkey, I told you before that Turkey received financial support both before the EU-Turkey statement and after the EU-Turkey statement. Although the relevant resources were rapidly mobilized, the achieved were not, the objectives were not achieved, and the facility, although it helped the refugees to address their basic needs, but the several issues were not clarified. For instance, the Turkish authorities refused to grant access to beneficiary data for cash assistance projects. So the EU cannot track the project beneficiaries from registration to payment. For instance, I may be entitled to receive money, but nobody knows whether I will receive that money or not. And the EU, most of all, who provides the money, cannot verify that. So this has been a problematic situation. You see in the graph here with the pink and the red lines, the relation between the overall humanitarian assistance given throughout the world by the EU and the humanitarian assistance given to Turkey in particular in 2016 and 2017. So you see that Turkey has been a major beneficiary of such assistance. With Africa, and we saw the map earlier, we have established an emergency trust fund for stability and addressing root causes of irregular migration. Africa has been divided in the so-called three windows, three regions, the Sahel and Lake Chad, the Horn of Africa, and North of Africa. And this tool is a flexible tool with speedy proceedings in order to implement projects that will discourage people from leaving their countries and come to Europe. Indeed, the number of irregular migrants were reduced after the activation of this emergency trust fund, but again, this contribution cannot be measured precisely by the European authorities due to lack of data given by the national authorities of the African states involved. Now, some figures regarding the budget provided to European schemes, such as the European Asylum Support Office and Frontex. You see here that the budgets are being increased steadily, and there are instances where this budget has been committed in significant percentages. With regard to EASO support, you can see that the budgets were absorbed completely. However, with regard to return support, there have been some amounts which were not used. Why? Because the member states do not trust Frontex. They decided to undertake the return procedure themselves. As simple as that. As with regard to the relocation scheme, as I explained to you before, it has not been a very successful scheme. However, it cost a significant amount, 225.6 million euros. So, as you see, it cost a lot for just 35 relocations, 35,000, 700 relocations. As for Frontex, it has a steady increase in its budget in order to cover the constant increase of its mandate, and the budget was increased from 19 million in 2006 to 460 million in 2020. Again, significant increases. Finally, with regard to the overall money invested in migration for the period 2021-2027, the Commission initially suggested a staggering increase from 13 billion to 34.9 billion euros, more than double. Of course, the ministers, the finance ministers did not accept that. They suggested that more popular categories of spending had to be addressed to. So there was a reduction of the approved amount to 22 billion euros. You see that how these amounts are distributed to the three major funds regarding migration: the Migration Fund, the Internal Security Fund, the Police Strand, and the Internal Security Fund, the Border Strand. You see how this money is being divided and what it received in the previous programming period. So you see the increase, and you see that lots of money is being invested in the improvement of the security of the borders. That's Frontex. And an interesting point is that for every resettled person, because the resettlement scheme is still live and kicking, is being given 10,000 euros as a lump sum payment. It is an incentive in order to facilitate such resettlements. If you take into account that in the previous programming period, no such incentives were given, this increase is a very significant incentive for people to be involved in such resettlement schemes. Now, to conclude, you can see that the EU has been focused on providing money instead of preparing policies. Why? It has identified its inability to operate within the framework set by its reduced competencies in the field of migration. Or it has encountered difficulties that discourage it from trying to do it again. So, in the EU's mentality, they have used their capability of providing funding in order to replace their inability to take legal or political action in the field of migration. However, providing money always gives you an edge, gives you a tool in order to communicate activities as you wish And thus, the EU has been seen as being mobilized in order to tackle this problem of migration, and has led the Commission to refer to these funding activities as proof of its action regarding solidarity towards the member states. Of course, we have here, when money is being given, and the money given by the EU to counter the migration flows, especially during the migration crisis, have created a situation of contradicting public interests. On the one side, we had the need to have flexible action to meet the operational needs, the immediate needs. On the other hand, all this money was given by overriding the legislation and the various audit proceedings. So EU funding was instrumentalized in order to meet immediate priorities and bypassing existing rules and auditing procedures. That is one problem. The second problem is that we have a monetization of legal and political issues. The EU is merely stating the provision of money as a means of policy implementation without taking the trouble of actually examining the substance of these policies. And it's up to the European Commission to take the necessary action when the new system will be in place. We don't know when that will happen, to make sure that the resulting added value for the EU will be verified, will be established, not by overriding the mechanisms of control, but by achieving concrete results. It is true. Yes.
So may we start?
That's the final slide. Don't worry.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that we could start a question. So I'm going to have one question. I have, of course, many for you. I could talk about this topic for a very long time. I know there are people in the room who came to hear your talk and had to leave for other classes, but I know there are people in the class who are doing research on this topic right now, and so I'll leave a lot of space for them to ask questions. Mm-hmm. And I guess my main question, I mean, I had a lot of little questions, like I was incredibly intrigued by 1 million refugees going from Ukraine to Russia. And that sounds a lot like forced migration to me, right? Like literally forced. Like this is the case in front of the ICC, you know, the taking of children and things like that. I'm wondering, I'm curious, I guess it's a tiny question. I'm curious how much voluntary migration there was from Ukraine to Russia, because from what I know, my news sources, my information sources, it looked quite involuntary to me. I know that there were some sympathetic Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine, but from what I saw public opinion polls, though, even those Russia-friendly ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine were quite activated towards Ukrainian identity by the invasion. And so that's a small question. I just couldn't help but answer it because I just genuinely was curious when I saw your slide. But I suppose my other question is just, you know, I agree with you. I really appreciate the cynicism of your presentation about calling the EU out as an actor that is really throwing money at a lot of things, perhaps without appropriate strategy and without the core policies of what they're doing being resolved. I mean, I hope that the students are stunned by the fact that the Dublin system has been under review since 2011, and yeah,
and still is under review.
And here we are, right? Exactly. And so I'm just curious about whether you think that throwing money at the problem is perpetuating a permanent, in this class we call it the Valley of Death, a permanent lack of resolution of integration on the topic. What do you think would actually create the reforms? And do you think that not throwing as much money at it would be part of the solution? So that's my question, and I'll invite anyone else then to follow up after me. But we also don't have that much time, so if you have a question, definitely think about it now. Get ready, okay?
Okay, first of all, just to give you my reaction to the first part of the question regarding the migration from Ukraine to Russia, there are no formal data from the Russian Federation. No.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with your estimate that there has to be some forced migration, because even those Russian-speaking or Russian, let's say, sympathizers from Ukraine, they didn't want to go to Russia. Maybe they have been forced, but formal data we do not have from the Russian Federation in that respect, unfortunately. And that is something that we're trying to establish, but so far with no success. Now, with regard to your second question, well, so far the European Commission and the European Union in general, but especially the European Commission, has been seen to be very satisfied by just declaring its capacity to throw away money. We have the money, we are using it, period. Don't complain about that, because you get money. That is, I know it sounds cynical. It is. However, that's true. And unfortunately, it's true. What it would take to change this mentality, I believe that the European Commission's history demonstrates that since 2000, since the resignation of the Santer Commission, we haven't seen a figure, political figure in the Commission that would actually transform the Commission from a mere managerial scheme to a more policy-making mechanism. Maybe the Commission has been accustomed to leave the initiative to the Council or a strong figure, a political leader. For instance, for more than 15 years in Europe, there was a dominant figure, Chancellor Merkel, in policy making terms. She was setting the pace. And the figures in the Commission, President Barroso, President Juncker, did not seem either capable or even willing to try to undertake a more proactive role in formulating policies. With regard to migration especially, don't forget that there was always a migration flow towards EU. After 2015, the situation changed dramatically. The Commission had to deal with let's say, the later stages of the economic crisis, first of all. And also, at some point, although they were preparing a much more ambitious review of the migration regime in Europe, we had COVID, which reintroduced even internal border controls. So I think it is a matter of both lack of will, political will, as well as circumstances that have reduced the Commission's and the European Union's in general desire to produce a more concrete policy regarding migration, and not just have a very extensive budget of facilitating national activities. Don't forget that they are hiding behind the shared competence idea. It is our shared competence. If you do it and you are satisfied with that, we will simply give you money. It's up to you to do it first, because it's nearer to the people according to the subsidiarity principle. So why bother?
Yeah, that aligns with my diagnosis too. And I would add another layer to it. A political economy diagnosis is that when you spend a lot of money on something, you get invested interest groups in that money. And then there you are. There isn't any other solution other than this embedded markets solution that involves a lot of money. And then you can't undo that in favor of maybe more policies that cost less, but are more equitable or effective. So, yeah.
We have a lack of policy. This is the main conclusion. I agree completely with you. we have a lack of policy. We don't. It is one of these cases that we do have the means, but we don't have the political substance. We don't have the strategy. And this is so obvious in the case of the European Union with regard to migration.
So, does anyone have, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm not trying to distance.
I'm sorry for taking too long. I'm terribly sorry.
Incredibly informative. I just, I know that some people have a hard deadline and have to leave, but I'm not telling people not to ask a question. I'm saying, please ask a question in the next 8 minutes. Okay? Yes.
Hi. Would you say the EU's extensive just use of money to like cover up these bullet wounds? I wrote in my notes like a bandage to cover up a bullet wound because they're really just throwing money at the issue. But anyways, I digress. How do you think that might be affecting xenophobia in these member states of the EU?
How does, excuse me, I didn't get the question?
I can repeat it closer maybe to the speaker and the microphone. How do you think that, what do you think the relationship is between this policy of essentially throwing money that you've described, and how do you think that interacts with or affects xenophobia in the EU? Do you think it makes it worse? Do you think it makes it more visible, less visible? How do you think those two things interact? Is that?
Well, I think that the member states seeing that they have the initiative and they get money and there is no political guidance from the part of the EU, well, that makes the member states, that allows the member states to develop more ideas regarding migrants, even to increase their reservations regarding the migration flows and so on. And this is a problem because each state has its own understanding about migration, unfortunately. We don't have a common understanding. And there are states that, for instance, you saw that if you compare what happens with the Ukrainian situation and the Mediterranean situation. In the Mediterranean situation, you had states that were not even conceiving in having one, not two, one migrant entering. And at the other, and on the other hand, when it came to Ukraine, everyone was willing to participate in the plan, the refugee plan that was used to support Ukrainians fleeing from Ukraine. So you see differentiation between the two conditions by the same actors, the member states. So that means that the member states have developed a selective reaction to migration conditions, and the EU has allowed that to happen instead of trying to forge a common agreement, a common concept, a common understanding, and just throwing away money and saying, okay, you can do whatever you want, this is the money, you get it, so you can proceed. Merely allows the member states to continue on their own devices.
Thank you.
My group is working on migration for our final project, and one expert we spoke to discussed the possibility of future migration as a means for solving Europe's growing age gap. So I guess as problems relating to labor shortages like increase moving forward, do you think that the approach to migration will like substantially shift in terms of like incorporating migrants into the labor force, or like making migration easier, that sort of thing?
Kaija, could you repeat because the microphone's a bit far away?
Yeah, sorry about that. So the question is, so the first part of your question, the second part of your question is, would something make things easier to incorporate migrants in the labor force? What was the first part of your question?
Like as it relates to Europe's growing age gap, I guess.
Yeah, so what is
the migrants to fill?
Yeah, so I'm trying to turn it, so the question is about a recognition of the demographic challenges of Europe. And is there a recognition, or do you think that'll inform the strategy of the growing demographic gap, and where does Europe's need for labor fit into this, both advanced and or white collar and blue collar, right? Yeah.
The thing is that the European Union, despite its rhetoric, has not actually produced a demographic policy. This has been left to the member states. So you see that the member states have adopted a migration policy that might need their own demographic situation. For instance, if they need skilled labor that they do not have, they may get it from migrants that are coming in Europe. However, the European Union itself has not interfered into that, has not produced a strategy regarding an overall understanding of the demographic situation in Europe, which there is a gap, and that gap keeps growing, and that's a problem. It's up to each member state to develop its own strategy regarding how they will meet the needs of the local or national labor markets, without considering at the same time the implications for the other member states, the neighboring member states. And don't forget, we're talking about a common market. So that would have at some point, will have some effect on the functioning of the common market, on the functioning of the common economy of Europe in the wider sense economy. But as we speak, it seems that the EU simply is watching.
Well, I'm going to conclude the webinar then, and thank you so much, Dimitrios. It's your expertise is so deep on this topic. Every time I think, oh, I know this topic, but then I learn 30–40% more than I knew before. So I really deeply appreciate it. So I can only imagine how informative it was for people who are learning about this, but there was something for everyone. So I'm very appreciative. Thank you so much. You want to join me in thanking you?
It has been a pleasure to see you all again in such a familiar surrounding. And hopefully we will see each other again, as I said, in person in springtime.